Hey everybody, Anthony here from Crazy Tech Lab, and today I'm going to be looking at 3 brand new coolers from Noctua. And normally there wouldn't be too much to say about that, other than Noctua's awesome build quality and great cooling usually. But these are some of the first air coolers that are specifically designed for AMD's Threadripper CPUs. So the NH-U9, the NH-U12S and the NH-U14S are all specifically designed and only compatible with AMD's Threadripper socket, which is socket TR4, of course. So there are 2 reasons why they're only compatible with Threadripper. Number one is that the processor socket is completely different to everything else, even socket AM4. The mounting holes are completely the wrong way round. But if I bring my Forbes branded AMD Threadripper CPU. This is the CPU they gave me to review on Forbes. If I bring that round and you have a closer look at it, you can see that the heat spreader is absolutely enormous. You're looking at something that is much, much larger even than Intel's high-end desktop processors, but is literally like 2 or 3 times the size of mainstream CPUs like Ryzen and Intel's Core i5, Core i7, those kind of things, the mainstream stuff. So that raises one big issue for processor coolers, such as processor manufacturers, should I say, such as Noctua, which is that the base plates on coolers like these are traditionally much, much smaller. Now the issue is that they don't end up covering the entire heat spreader, and some of them won't even cover all the cores underneath underneath that heat spreader, which occupies around 2/3 of the space under there. So the problem with that is that it means that you're not getting the best thermal transfer, the best thermal efficiency, because the whole of the heat spreader is going to be getting hot, and if you're not cooling all of it, you're going to be missing out on some, potentially on some thermal performance. So what Noctua has done, as you can see, is it's basically mounted some enormous contact plates on all 3 of the coolers here. And if I just grab my Threadripper defunct model, so no one complain about the fact I'm touching the pins underneath. It is a defunct CPU. It doesn't work. It's literally just something to show off. But as you can see, there is the Noctua base plate, and it is exactly the same size, actually a little bit bigger than the Threadripper CPU, so it completely covers it lengthways and widthways, which means that you are getting maximum thermal transfer from your Threadripper CPU, and that is the reason why these coolers aren't compatible with any other sockets. So if you're buying any of them, you need to make sure that it has the TR4 SP3 at the end, as you can see on the NH-U9 there. So if it doesn't have that, you're not going to be getting a cooler that is Threadripper compatible. It must have that at the end. So all 3 of these coolers are currently available in the US and in Europe and in the UK, which is where I'm from. So price-wise, in the US and the UK, should I mention, that they're all very, very similar, which is a little odd given that the NH-U9 is a tiny 90mm cooler, and the NH-U14S, as its name suggests, is a pretty hefty 140mm cooler. So the issue with that is that cooling is clearly going to be different across the range here. Now price wise, we're looking at $80 in the US for the U14S, $70 for the NH-U12S, and the same price, $70 for the NH-U9, the tiny one. So the fact that these 2 are actually the same price does raise some questions, which I'll get to later once we talk about performance. I have tested all of these coolers using the 1950X at stock speed, so you can look at the results later in the video. And in the UK, we're looking at around £70 for the larger NH-U14S. Again, £70 for the NH-U12S, and it's slightly lower for the NH-U9, which is £63. So in the UK, there's literally no difference between the 2 largest coolers here, but you'll be paying £10 more than the NH-U9. So without further ado, let's get rid of the boxes and have a look at the coolers. just wanted to show you the you know, the epic packaging that you can expect with Noctua coolers. This has always been the same. It's absolutely epic. Everything's so neatly laid out, and it's actually this one isn't even the most impressive, because some of the more complicated coolers, it's all really nicely laid out, and you get accessories that are equally well laid out, those kind of things. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that. So here we are with all three CPU coolers, and as you can see, the NH-U9 is a lot smaller than any of the other ones, and the reason why you consider such a small cooler, because obviously you know, given the pricing, you'd almost certainly go for one of the larger two coolers. The reason why you'd consider the NH-U9 is if you're severely height limited. So the height here is only 125 millimeters, so making it great for you know, rack mount servers and those kind of things. And it does have a TDP, you know, a thermal thermal power, the amount of heat it can dissipate, of 180 watts, which is exactly the same as the Threadripper 1950X. So you'd hope that it'd be able to obtain that CPU with all cores loaded, that kind of thing. So out of the box, you get two fans. It's the only cooler here to actually include two fans in the box, which means that there aren't any extra fan clips like you get with the other two fans to mount additional fans. You get two 92mm fans in the box, and the mounting is really easy, because it's like Intel's high-end socket. You've got threaded holes around the CPU, and these sprung screws here just basically screw in, so it's literally, you can mount this in about 60 seconds. It's really easy. Accessory wise, you get a screwdriver to do just that, some thermal paste as well, and a two-way splitter and low noise adapter for the PWM cables here. So I don't know how it's going to perform with the low noise adapter. I do have some performance numbers later that you can look at, but obviously reducing the fan speed is going to reduce that thermal power that this cooler is capable of. So we'll have to see what happens later. So the NH-U12S for Threadripper, very similar to Noctua's other coolers, of course, and it's slightly shorter and slightly slimmer than the 140mm version over there, but again, I think this is around 158mm high, so you're not really losing that much. I think the NH-U14S is about 165mm tall, so unless your case, you know, has some quirky you know, height limitation, you'd probably go for the 140mm version, to be honest. Again, there's the similar contact plate underneath, the extra large contact plate. There are 5 6mm heat pipes. That's actually one less than the 92mm cooler over here. They've managed to shoehorn 6 in there just due to the fact that it's a slightly thicker heatsink, albeit it's smaller overall. And again, you get one fan in the box, so there are fan clips included to mount a second fan at the rear as well. So moving swiftly on to the U14S. And Noctua has actually employed a 150mm fan here. If you actually measure the internal diameter there, it's actually slightly wider, the diameter there, than a 140mm fan. So the benefits of that is you get that extra airflow punch going through the heatsink. Again, like the U12S, you get an extra couple of fan clips to mount a second cooler on the back. And with both coolers, the U12S and the U14S here, you get additional anti-vibration mounts for the second fan as well. And of course, you get a low noise adapter with both coolers to reduce the fan speed of that fan, should it be too noisy for you under load. They're both really quiet to start with, but if you want a practically silent PC, then or silent cooler, should I say, then you might want to use it. Again, here there are 6 6mm heat pipes, so that's one more than the NH-U12S behind me. So what I'll do now is just bring a Threadripper motherboard through, which in this case is MSI's X399 Gaming Pro Carbon. And as you can see, it's got, sort of standard spaced DIMM slots here, so they're fairly close to the CPU socket, whereas on the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme, I believe that's what it's called, yeah, some boxes behind me, the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme, the DIMM slots are actually slightly further away. So in terms of whether any of these coolers are going to impact on the slots you're going to be able to use, I will look into the ROG Zenith Extreme in a second, but this is just your standard ATX motherboard for now. So starting with the NH-U9. I'll just place it into its respective mounting holes there to start with. And as you can see, clearly the first two slots here on either side of the CPU are going to be obscured by the cooler here. I'll just see if I can lift that up so you can see a little clearer. So yeah, we're looking at the first two slots on either side of the CPU being obscured by those two fans. So you'll need to opt for one of the other two coolers if you want to make use of all 8 DIMM slots. Now I'm actually looking here, and unfortunately it looks like the second DIMM slot is also being obscured by this cooler. I'm just going to try and line it up without. There we go. That's actually slotted into the holes there. So yeah, I'm actually looking here, and it's actually the on the left side, the first 2 slots are actually overhung by that fan. So you'll be looking at using low profile memory only with this cooler. Probably not much of an issue if you're using it in a rack mount PC or something like that, or a server where you're not too fussed about aesthetics, but that does rule out using any of the RGB memory like G-Skill's Trident Z RGB, which looks awesome in these motherboards, of course. Moving on to the NH-U12S. Again, I'll just place it into those slots there and see what happens. So at the back here, obviously with a single fan, you're not looking at blocking any memory slots. But over the other side here, I think you'll just about get away with that. I think the, just double check that's still lined up. Yeah, so oh, it's very, very close. I think it does stray into that memory slot by about 1 millimeter or so. So that first DIMM slot there will actually be touching the memory module. If you have one that's really tall, like a Corsair Dominator, something like that, it will actually end up touching the cooler here, which yeah, it's probably not ideal. So again, with this cooler, you're probably looking at either using low profile memory if you want to use all the slots, or just sticking to the outer slots with a 4 memory stick setup. Now the U14S is slightly deeper, I believe, than the U14S. So yeah, you're looking at definitely that first slot there being overhung by the fan here. And I'll just show you that it's it's definitely overhanging that first slot there, which is a bit of a shame. But again, you're hoping that the bigger cooler is actually going to offer better cooling. So again, you're not going to be able to use all of the memory slots there. You're looking at low profile memory at the very least. And the best idea will be to use the a full DIMM setup where you can use the outer slots. So I would just go and grab my Asus board, which is down here. So if you do have the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme, then we're about to see whether it's a slightly different story with an E80X motherboard like this. So with the NH-U9, it's basically you're still looking at the those fans overhanging those 2 memory slots. The others are all absolutely fine. Swapping over to the NH-U12S, which is slightly bigger, and well, hey, we've actually got complete clearance of all the memory slots there. So that's very handy to know if you wanted to fill them all with some lovely RGB memory. And just a quick look here, and it's exactly the same with the U14S. So if you want to fill all the slots, it's clear you're going to want to go for the 2 larger coolers, because they completely clear all of those memory slots, which is great. So it's now time to talk about for performance. So I will just bring up my graph, and let's start with the most interesting result, which is that the 87 degrees that you can see at the bottom there, in which I've highlighted in red, is basically the processor throttling. So it got to 87 degrees. That's with the 1950X, Threadripper 1950X, and that's loaded across all 16 cores, sorry, using Prime 95. So it's the maximum heat load you're going to expect with this processor. And unfortunately, yeah, 87 degrees in Ryzen Master, and it saw the processor throttling itself. So it's basically reducing the clock speed and voltage to get that heat down to prevent damage to the processor. So you're not going to be damaging your Threadripper CPU by doing that, but equally you're running it, at very, very high temperatures, and you'll be getting reduced performance as well as that clock speed reduces. Now, at full speed, the same cooler did actually manage to tame the processor. So 83 degrees C, that's what, 4 degrees away from throttling, and that's, you know, maximum heat load on AMD's flagship desktop processor. So that's still a, you know, really good result. If you're desperate for, you know, a really low profile cooler for your Threadripper CPU, this is probably it, although I'd maybe steer towards an all-in-one liquid cooler if you're not limited to, you know, like a rack mount, you know, type case, something like that. So it is capable of taming the Threadripper CPU, which is remarkable for such a small cooler. Now, moving on to the NH-U12S, and obviously you're getting much better performance here. It's a bigger cooler with a bigger fan, and at full speed you're looking at 76 degrees C, so that's 7 degrees cooler than the NH-U9, and that only rose by 3 degrees by using the low noise adapter as well. So probably not a lot of room for overclocking there, but certainly you're looking at, you know, a solid performance with, you know, scope for using this as a you know, using this cooler if you're rendering a lot of the time. So putting all 16 cores on the 1950X under full load for prolonged periods, this cooler is able to do it. Again, I'd maybe steer clear of the low noise adapter if you're going to be doing that for any length of time. You know, 79 degrees at room temperature is reasonable, but you're only 8 degrees C away from the CPU throttling. So again, this was done for 10 minutes, so I'd imagine that, you know, most rendering periods would be much longer than that. It just depends on what program you're using and those kind of things. If it's rendering or video editing, of course, I guess rendering might take a bit longer. But it's you know, it's a solid performance. But of course, there is the fact that the NH-U14S, the biggest cooler here, is not that much more expensive. In the UK, I think it's actually the same price as the 120mm version, and you get even better cooling. So at full speed, you're looking at 70 degrees C under load. That's 17 degrees C away from throttling. So there's possibly even scope for overclocking the Threadripper CPU there. And using the low noise adapter, where it's pretty much inaudible more than a few feet away, it still manages 74 degrees C, which is 2 degrees better than the U12S managed at full speed. So again, kind of comes back to what we said earlier, that there's one winner here. And let's move back to my table. Okay, so here we are back again at the table with all three of the Noctua Threadripper coolers, and it all boils down to pricing, doesn't it? Unfortunately for the smaller two coolers, the NH-U14S is the same price in the UK and only $10 more in the US. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the only cooler you should be considering. It's pretty much the same size as the NH-U12S. It's slightly deeper and slightly taller, but with most cases offering, you know, over 165mm of height clearance. This of course sits at 165mm. It's an absolute no-brainer, and even in the US, when you're paying $10 more, it's still a no-brainer. You get that extra cooling and possibly enough headroom for a sneaky overclock as well. So whether you're in the US or the UK, you can pretty much discount the U12S unless, you know, you need a slightly smaller cooler than the big boy here. And that of course leaves us with one final cooler, which is the dinky but very compact NH-U9. Now, the NH-U9 did manage to tame the Threadripper 1950X, albeit only at its full speed and at a room temperature of 23 degrees. So if you've got a higher room temperature than that and you're planning to overclock or anything else that's going to hamper cooling or increase the heat load, then this is definitely not the cooler for you. It's amazing that it actually managed to tame the Threadripper CPU, but then Noctua does specify a TDP of 180 watts capability for this cooler, which is exactly what the Threadripper 1950X is. So you kind of hope that it would be able to tame the Threadripper CPU at full speed. So quite why Noctua included a low noise adapter in the box, I'm not entirely sure. Seeing as, you know, it's always going to reduce the heat load. I mean, you could potentially underclock your Threadripper 1950X and you know, get reasonable cooling that way. That is another option. But unless you're severely height limited and you don't want to opt for any form of liquid cooling, then yeah, that's the only kind of situation that you'd want to consider this this CPU cooler. Personally, I'd, you know, if it was severely height limited, I'd probably rig up some kind of DIY liquid cooling and have an external radiator or something like that if I was that desperate. But again, it's amazing that it did actually manage to keep the 9050X tamed. So I would like to thank AMD and Intel for providing most of the samples here today, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to check out my other videos and of course subscribe. Thanks a lot.